Imagine you're standing in the middle of an ancient Egyptian marketplace. The afternoon sun is blazing, merchants are shouting over each other, children run through narrow streets, priests walk toward towering temples carrying incense. Everything feels alive. Then, a small cat steps into the road. Instantly, the crowd freezes. Not because the cat is blocking the way, not because anyone is afraid it might attack, but because one careless step, one frightened reaction, one accidental mistake could ruin your life forever. Today, that sounds ridiculous. If a cat crosses your path, you might smile, take a picture, or simply walk around it. Some people even joke that cats act like they own the house, but travel back more than 3,000 years, and that same animal wasn't treated like a pet. It wasn't just respected, it wasn't simply protected, it was sacred. And somehow, one of the deadliest civilizations in history, a civilization that built pyramids, fought massive wars, and ruled millions of people, believed that harming one small cat could offend the gods themselves. How does an ordinary animal reach that kind of status? The answer begins long before temples, long before priests, long before anyone carved statues of cats. It begins with something much simpler. Hunger. Ancient Egypt looked powerful, but underneath that power, everything depended on one thing: the Nile River. Every year the river flooded. When the water pulled back, it left behind rich black soil that could grow enormous amounts of wheat and barley. Those harvests fed entire cities. They supported armies, they built monuments. Without grain, there was no Egypt, but storing grain created a dangerous problem. The moment thousands of sacks of food filled wooden granaries, they attracted visitors, not human visitors. Rodents, rats, mice, thousands of them. Imagine spending an entire year growing food, only to watch tiny animals destroy it before your family could eat. One infestation could erase months of work. Enough grain lost, and entire villages could face starvation before the next flood season arrived. The Egyptians had traps, they had guards, they had storage buildings. But none of those solutions worked as well as nature's own hunter. Wildcats. Long before cats lived inside homes, African wildcats quietly hunted near the edges of villages. They weren't interested in people. They were following something else: the rodents. Every rat meant an easy meal. Every mouse hiding inside a granary became another opportunity. Without realizing it, humans and cats had entered an agreement. The people protected the grain attracted rodents, the rodents attracted cats, and the cats protected the people. Nobody signed a contract. Nobody decided to domesticate them overnight. It happened slowly, generation after generation. The friendliest cats stayed close to humans. The least fearful survived. People began leaving food nearby. Cats kept returning. Eventually, they stopped being visitors. They became neighbors. And that's where most people think the story ends. Humans needed pest control. Cats provided it. Simple. Except, that's not what happened. Because something strange occurred over the next few centuries. The Egyptians didn't just appreciate cats. They transformed them into something far greater, something almost unimaginable today. A creature that hunted rats became a living symbol of divine power. Why? Because Egyptians rarely believed events happened by accident. To them, order wasn't random. The flooding of the Nile, the rising of the sun, the changing of the seasons, everything reflected the will of higher powers. So when one animal repeatedly protected the food that kept the kingdom alive, it became difficult to see that animal as ordinary. Protection gradually became sacred protection. The line between nature and religion started disappearing. Soon, artists weren't simply drawing cats. Priests weren't simply feeding them. They were connecting them to one of Egypt's most beloved deities, Bastet. Today, many people think Bastet was simply the cat goddess. But that's only part of the story. She represented protection, family, motherhood, joy, music, home, and perhaps most importantly, she represented the invisible force that kept chaos away. A peaceful home, healthy children, safe families, successful harvests, all of these belonged to her domain. The cat became her living reminder, not because every cat was believed to be a god, but because every cat reflected qualities the Egyptians deeply admired: grace, patience, precision, and sudden, overwhelming power. Anyone who's owned a cat understands this. One moment, it sleeps peacefully. The next, it moves faster than your eyes can follow. Ancient Egyptians noticed exactly the same thing. To them, that wasn't ordinary behavior. It looked divine. And once an entire civilization starts believing an animal carries sacred meaning, everything changes. Homes change, temples change, even the law begins to change. And that's where the story becomes almost unbelievable. Because protecting cats was no longer just an act of kindness, it became something far more serious, something that even powerful rulers sometimes couldn't ignore. So what happened when an ordinary family cat died? Today, most people bury a pet, keep a few photographs, and eventually move on. Ancient Egyptians did something entirely different, because to them, the death of a cat wasn't just the loss of an animal, it was the loss of a sacred protector. Historical evidence suggests that many Egyptian families entered periods of mourning after the death of a beloved cat. Some ancient writers even described owners shaving off their eyebrows as a visible sign of grief. Imagine that, thousands of years before social media, before newspapers, your face itself announced to everyone around you that your family had suffered a loss. But mourning wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning, because Egyptians believed death wasn't an ending, it was a journey. The body mattered, the afterlife mattered, preparation mattered. That's why kings became mummies. Priests became mummies, and in many cases, cats did too. Today, archaeologists have discovered enormous cemeteries filled with cat mummies. Not dozens, not hundreds. Hundreds of thousands. Some were wrapped carefully in linen. Others were decorated with incredible detail. Many were buried beside small statues and offerings. For modern people, that sounds almost impossible. Why would anyone spend so much effort preserving an animal? The answer lies in how Egyptians viewed the relationship between humans, animals, and the gods. They didn't always separate them the way we do. Certain animals reflected divine qualities. Falcons represented the sky, crocodiles represented power, ibises symbolized wisdom, and cats represented protection. They guarded homes, protected food, defended children from snakes and dangerous creatures. Over generations, their practical importance became spiritual importance, and once something became sacred, protecting it became everyone's responsibility. That responsibility eventually reached the law. Ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote about an incident during the later periods of Egyptian history. According to his account, a Roman accidentally killed a cat. It wasn't deliberate, it wasn't part of a crime, but an angry crowd gathered almost immediately. The king himself reportedly couldn't calm them. The man was killed by the mob. Now, historians still debate every detail of this story. Ancient writers sometimes exaggerated dramatic events. But the fact that stories like this were widely believed tells us something important. Egypt's respect for cats wasn't ordinary. Foreign visitors noticed it, they wrote about it, and centuries later, we're still talking about it. But here's where the story becomes even stranger. Because protecting cats wasn't only about religion, it may have changed history itself. Picture the year 525 BC. Egypt is facing one of the greatest military threats in its history. The Persian Empire. An enormous army marches toward Egyptian territory. Soldiers prepare for battle. Generals organize defenses. Everyone expects a bloody fight. Then, according to later historical accounts, the Persian king Cambyses II used an idea so unusual that people still debate it today. Some ancient sources claim Persian soldiers painted cats onto their shields. Others go even further. They claim live cats were brought onto the battlefield itself. The logic was simple. If Egyptian soldiers feared injuring sacred animals, would they hesitate to fire arrows? Would they refuse to charge? Would a single belief become stronger than military strategy? Modern historians aren't certain exactly what happened. Some believe later writers exaggerated the story. Others think parts of it may contain truth. But whether every detail is accurate isn't actually the fascinating part. The fascinating part is that the story sounded believable because everyone already understood one thing. Egyptians valued cats so deeply that even their enemies believed those animals could influence a battle. Think about that. An animal so respected that opposing armies supposedly considered using it as psychological warfare. Very few civilizations in history have treated any creature with that level of importance. But despite everything we've talked about, the temples, the mummies, the laws, the battlefield legends, we've still missed the biggest question. Why cats? Why not dogs? Why not horses? Why did this one quiet hunter become the face of divine protection? while countless other useful animals never reached the same status. To answer that, we have to look beyond religion, beyond history, and into the unique personality of cats themselves. Because the Egyptians weren't just worshipping what cats did, they were fascinated by what cats were. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden stories behind ancient civilizations, subscribe for more history that feels stranger than fiction. Because history isn't boring, it's just waiting to be told the right way.